You there. The boy hiding behind the equipment cases. Florence Ashby's voice cut through the Grandview Concert Hall like a scalpel. 3,000 phones turned toward the wings. Reuben Hensley was 12 years old, wearing his father's oversized janitor polo. His hands gripped a mop handle. I said come here. She gestured impatiently, her diamond-encrusted microphone catching the spotlight. Sidney Hensley stepped forward instinctively, but Florence's assistant blocked him. Not you. The boy. Reuben walked onto the stage, each step impossibly long. The audience murmured. Florence smiled for the cameras, who practiced curves of sympathy that had sold 14 million albums. What's your name, sweetheart? Reuben, ma'am. Reuben. She repeated it slowly, showing concern. Your father works here, doesn't he? Cleans up after people like me. The crowd laughed, uncomfortable. She crouched to his eye level, microphone angled perfectly for the broadcast. Tell me something, Reuben. Can you even sing? The question hung there, seemingly innocent. But Reuben saw something flicker behind her eyes. Recognition. Fear. Florence Ashby leaned closer, her voice dropping below the microphone's range, but his still live. Be smart, kid. Say no. The audience held its breath. What Reuben did next didn't just expose a fraud. It destroyed a 20-year empire built on a lie. 6 hours earlier, Reuben had watched his father scrub vomit from the green room carpet while Florence Ashby's tour manager stepped over him without acknowledgement. They lived in a rent-controlled apartment in Riverside, 40 minutes from the venue when traffic cooperated. His mother, Margaret, worked double shifts as a medical transcriptionist, her fingers moving across the keyboard even during dinner, always racing the deadline for the next payment. Sidney Hensley had once been something else. He'd attended the Berkeley Music Conservatory for exactly 1 semester before Margaret got pregnant with Reuben. He'd withdrawn quietly, taken the janitor position at the Grandview, and never mentioned it again. The only evidence was a single-framed certificate in their hallway and the way Sidney's eyes would close when opera played on the classical station during their drives. Reuben had inherited something from his father that neither of them discussed. He'd been humming Mozart at 4, correcting pitch at 6. By 10, he could reproduce any aria he heard once, his voice carrying a clarity that didn't match his shy demeanor. Sidney would listen from the doorway of Reuben's room, never interrupting, his expression caught between pride and something that looked like grief. There was no money for lessons. Margaret had researched the conservatory prep programs once, $8,400 per semester, not including travel costs. She'd closed the laptop without saying anything. So Reuben sang in secret, to the walls of his room, teaching himself from recordings Sidney would play softly while cleaning the empty venue after shows. His range was unusual for his age, a clear soprano reaching E6, with a technique he'd developed entirely by ear. He didn't know this was rare. He just knew it felt like the only honest thing in his life. During setup that afternoon, Reuben had been helping his father inventory the storage closets backstage, staying invisible the way Sidney had taught him. We're guests in their world, Sidney always said. We don't draw attention. But Reuben had heard voices from Florence Ashby's dressing suite, the door slightly ajar. He'd frozen, recognizing the panic in her tone. Trevor, I can't hit it. The surgeon said a minimum of 8 weeks, and we're at 4. The scar tissue hasn't, Florence's voice cracked. Which is why we're using the full vocal track. That was Trevor Marsh, her manager, the man who'd made Sidney reclean the same hallway 3 times that morning. The system is flawless. The monitors will feed you the track a millisecond ahead. You mouth it perfectly. No one will know. The entire performance. Every note above G5. Which is essentially every money note you're known for. Florence, your tour insurance doesn't cover voluntary surgery. If this gets out, we're talking 30 million in breached contracts. Silence. Then, what about the crew? The sound engineer? Already handled. NDAs with penalty clauses that would bankrupt them. Everyone's locked in. Reuben had stood there, barely breathing, understanding dawning like cold water. The voice that had defined Florence Ashby, the supernatural range that made her famous, the signature high C that she called God's gift, it was all manufactured. And tonight, 3,000 people who'd paid $200 minimum would be watching a pantomime. He'd returned to his father and said nothing. Who would believe a janitor's son? But now, standing under the spotlight with Florence's whispered threat still echoing and Trevor Marsh watching from stage left with his arms crossed, Reuben understood something else. She'd seen him that afternoon. Outside her dressing room. His reflection in the hallway mirror. This wasn't a gesture of generosity or a heartwarming moment with a fan's child. This was a preemptive strike. Put him on stage, humiliate him publicly, ensure that if he ever spoke about what he'd heard, he'd already be established as a foolish kid who couldn't even sing when given the chance. The house band started the opening measures of Eternal Aria, Florence's signature piece. The one that climbed relentlessly toward that impossible C6 that had made her a legend. Reuben's throat tightened. I don't think I can. Of course you can, sweetheart. Florence's voice boomed through the speakers, warm and encouraging for the 3,000 witnesses. Just open your mouth and let it happen. But the song was a trap. The final phrase required technical precision that took years to develop, breath control that Reuben had only practiced alone, never under pressure, never in front of anyone. The string swelled. The audience leaned forward. Trevor Marsh smiled from the wings. And Reuben realized his father was watching from the edge of the stage, one hand gripping a cleaning cart, his expression unreadable. The same man who taught him that integrity mattered more than safety. Who'd given up everything to provide for his family. Who'd never once asked Reuben to make himself small. The music reached the verse. Florence gestured for him to begin. Reuben looked at the microphone in his hand. Then at the 3,000 phone recordings. Then at his father. And made a choice that would change everything. Sidney Hensley had been invisible for so long, he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen. He pushed his cleaning cart through the backstage corridor of the Grandview Concert Hall, the wheels squeaking against polished marble that cost more per square foot than his monthly rent. 12 years he'd worked here. 12 years of erasing other people's messes. Hey! Janitor! The voice belonged to Marcus, Florence Ashby's tour coordinator, a man whose cologne announced him 3 hallways in advance. There's a scuff mark on the stage left wing. Florence will lose her mind if she sees it before the show. Sidney nodded, already changing direction. I'll take care of it. You better. Last venue, she had someone fired for leaving a water bottle in her sightline. Marcus didn't wait for a response, already scrolling through his phone as he walked away. Reuben watched from where he sat on an equipment case, his thin legs dangling, his father's oversized work shirt making him look even smaller than his 12 years. He'd come straight from school, his backpack still slung over one shoulder, because their apartment was 40 minutes away and Sidney's shift didn't end until 11. This was normal. Homework in empty dressing rooms. Dinner from vending machines. The hum of other people's glamour happening just beyond the walls. Sidney knelt on stage, working at the mark with methodical precision. From the wings, Reuben could see the vast emptiness of the 3,000-seat auditorium, red velvet chairs waiting like silent witnesses. In 6 hours, those seats would be filled with people who'd paid $200 minimum to hear Florence Ashby sing. They'd applaud. They'd film it on their phones. They'd go home feeling like they'd witnessed something transcendent. And Sidney would still be here, cleaning up after them. Excuse me. Florence Ashby's voice cut through the space like a spotlight finding its target. She stood at center stage, her assistant trailing behind with an iPad and 3 different types of bottled water. She wore a silk rehearsal robe that probably cost more than Sidney's car. "Are you almost finished? I need the stage clear for my vocal warm-up." Sidney stood quickly, gathering his supplies. "Yes, ma'am. Just finishing." "Good. Because I can't exactly practice with," she gestured vaguely at him, at the cart, at the evidence of labor that kept her world functioning. "All this in the way." Sidney moved faster. Reuben watched his father's shoulders curve inward, the way they always did when someone reminded him of his place. The way they'd curved when the landlord came for late rent. When Margaret's transcription company cut her rate. When the conservatory letter had arrived years ago, and Sidney had quietly shredded it without telling anyone he'd applied for a teaching position. Florence didn't thank him. She simply began her scales the moment he stepped into the wings, her voice filling the empty hall with practiced perfection. Reuben listened, his perfect pitch cataloging every note, every breath, every tiny adjustment she made. She was good. Technically flawless. But there was something manufactured about it, like listening to a recording instead of a living person. Sidney returned to where Reuben sat, setting down the cart with careful silence. "Dad?" Reuben whispered. "Why do you let them talk to you like that?" Sidney's hand found his son's shoulder. When he spoke, his voice was steady. "Because we need this job. And because how people treat us says more about them than it does about us." Reuben wanted to believe that. He tried to believe dignity could survive being invisible. But watching his father disappear into the background again, he wasn't sure either of them did. The Hensley apartment smelled like burnt coffee and Margaret's lavender hand cream, scents that meant home even when home was cramped. Reuben sat at the kitchen table that doubled as his desk, his music theory textbook open to a chapter on operatic composition. He'd borrowed it from the library 3 times now, each checkout period stretching until the librarian just smiled and waved him through without scanning it. Margaret moved through the kitchen in her medical transcription headset, her fingers typing even as she reached for her water glass. She worked from a laptop positioned on the counter, always standing, always moving, because sitting still meant falling behind and falling behind meant losing clients. "Reuben, did you eat?" she called, not looking up. "Yes, Mom." He'd had the last of the mac and cheese. His younger brother would complain tomorrow, but that was tomorrow's problem. Sidney wasn't home yet. Wednesday nights meant deep cleaning the orchestra pit, a job that took until midnight because Florence Ashby's stage director insisted on it being pristine for the musicians' return. Never mind that the musicians wouldn't arrive until Friday. Reuben waited until his mother's typing rhythm indicated deep focus, then slipped his earbuds in and pulled up the recording he'd saved on his phone. It was Puccini's Nessun Dorma, performed by a tenor whose name he'd forgotten but whose technique he'd memorized. He let the aria play through once, his eyes closed, his breath matching the phrases. Then he stopped the recording and sang it back. His voice filled the kitchen, pure and unguarded, hitting notes that shouldn't have been possible for a 12-year-old boy. The high B-flat at the climax rang out clear and controlled, his breath support instinctive, his pitch flawless. He'd taught himself this. Every note. Every phrase. Every technical adjustment that professional singers spent years learning in conservatories he'd never see. When he finished, the apartment was silent except for the stopped clicking of his mother's keyboard. Margaret stood in the doorway, her headset pushed back, her expression caught between wonder and something that looked like grief. "Reuben. How long have you been able to do that?" "I don't know." "A while." She crossed the room, her hands finding his face, studying him like he was something fragile. "That's not normal, baby." She stopped, searching for words. "Your father needs to hear this." "No." Reuben pulled back. "Dad has enough to worry about." "Reuben." "Mom, what are we going to do?" Even if I'm good, so what? We can't afford lessons. We can't afford applications. We can't afford, he gestured at the walls, at the life they were living. Any of it. Margaret's jaw tightened. She looked at her laptop, at the transcript waiting, at the hours still ahead of her. Then back at her son. Talent like that doesn't just go away because we're poor. It doesn't disappear because life is hard. Then what does it do? She didn't answer. Because they both knew. It stayed hidden. It sang to empty kitchens and borrowed textbooks. It lived in the space between what was possible and what was permitted. Later that night, after Margaret had gone back to work and Reuben had finished his homework, he stood at his bedroom window watching the city lights. Somewhere out there, Florence Ashby was probably in her hotel suite, probably ordering room service that cost more than their weekly grocery budget, probably preparing for a performance that would make people weep with its beauty. And tomorrow, Sidney would clean up after her again. Reuben closed his eyes and sang softly, just for himself, the melody carrying through the thin walls into the night. His perfect pitch found every note. His range climbed effortlessly. His technique, entirely self-taught, would have made conservatory professors stop in their tracks. But there was no one listening who mattered. And maybe there never would be. The backstage storage closet smelled like dust and old velvet curtains, a space forgotten by everyone except the people paid to remember it. Reuben had been helping Sidney inventory supplies, counting cable ties and marking clipboards, when the voices had drifted through the wall. Florence Ashby's dressing suite shared a ventilation shaft with the storage room. Reuben hadn't meant to eavesdrop. But the panic in her voice made him freeze. "Trevor, I can't hit it." Florence's words came fast, desperate. "The surgeon said minimum 8 weeks for the scar tissue to. Which is exactly why we're using the full vocal track." That was Trevor Marsh, her manager, the man who'd made Sidney re-clean a hallway 3 times that morning because the baseboards weren't reflective enough. His voice carried the kind of calm that came from having already decided everything. "The system is flawless. The monitors feed you the track a millisecond ahead. You mouth along perfectly. No one will know." Silence. Then Florence again, quieter, "The entire performance. Every note above G5. Which is essentially every signature moment you're known for. Florence, your tour insurance doesn't cover elective vocal surgery. If this gets out, we're talking about 30 million in breached contracts. Venues, sponsors, streaming rights, it all collapses." Reuben's hands had gone still on the clipboard. His father was 2 aisles over, oblivious, counting light filters. "What about the sound crew?" Florence asked. "The monitor engineer will know. Already handled. NDA with a penalty clause that would bankrupt him and his family. Same for the track operator and the stage manager. Everyone who needs to know is locked in legally. Everyone else thinks it's standard backing vocal support. And if someone notices? If someone hears the difference? Who's going to notice? Your audience isn't trained vocalists. They're fans. They hear what they expect to hear. And what they expect is you, hitting notes you've been hitting for 20 years. The illusion is perfect." Another pause. Reuben could hear Florence pacing, her heels clicking against hardwood. "I built my career on that range. On that high C. If people find out it's not real." "It is real," Trevor cut in. "It's your voice on the track. Pre-recorded when you were healthy. You're not lying about who you are. You're just protecting what you've already built. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Florence. Do you want to cancel the tour? Do you want to issue refunds and face the lawsuits and watch your brand collapse because you chose honesty over pragmatism? Because I can make that call right now." The pacing stopped. When Florence spoke again, her voice was hollow. No. We proceed as planned. Good. Soundcheck is in 90 minutes. We'll run through the system then. Trust me. No one will ever know. Footsteps moved toward the door. Reuben grabbed a random box, pretending to be absorbed in inventory, his heart slamming against his ribs. Through the crack in the doorway, he saw Trevor emerge first, checking his phone. Then Florence, her face a careful mask of composure. She glanced down the hallway, and for a split second, her eyes met Reuben's reflection in the mirror hanging opposite the storage room. She knew he'd heard. The recognition flickered across her face, quick calculation, assessment, dismissal. He was just the janitor's kid. No one important. No one who mattered. She walked away without breaking stride. Reuben stood there, the inventory clipboard trembling in his hands. Sidney appeared from behind the shelving unit, carrying a box of spare microphone cables. "You okay, Reuben? You look pale." "I'm fine." But he wasn't. Because he'd just learned something that would burn through him like acid. The voice that had inspired him, the technique he'd been studying, the performances he'd analyzed obsessively, it was all a manufactured lie. Florence Ashby, the opera pop sensation, the vocalist critics called the voice of a generation, couldn't actually sing her own signature notes anymore. And tonight, 3,000 people would pay to watch her pretend. Sidney's hand landed on his shoulder. "Hey. Whatever's bothering you, we can talk about it." Reuben looked at his father, this good man who'd sacrificed everything, who'd given up his own musical dreams, who'd spent 12 years being treated like furniture by people who'd collapse without him. And he thought about Florence Ashby, who'd built an empire on authenticity while living a lie. "Dad?" Reuben's voice came out smaller than he intended. "What do you do when you know something's wrong but no one would believe you if you told them?" Sidney studied him for a long moment. Then he knelt down, eye level, the way he did when something mattered. "You tell the truth anyway. Because your integrity isn't about whether people listen. It's about whether you can live with your silence." Reuben nodded, but the weight in his chest didn't lift. Because he was 12 years old. The son of a janitor. And he'd just discovered that the music industry's brightest star was a fraud. Who was going to believe him? The Grandview Concert Hall blazed with light and noise. 3,000 people filled the red velvet seats, their phones already raised, ready to capture the moment Florence Ashby took the stage. Reuben sat in the wings on an equipment case, his homework forgotten in his lap. Sidney was nearby, stationed with his cleaning cart in case of spills or emergencies, another invisible body keeping the machine running. Florence swept past them in her opening costume, a glittering silver gown that caught every spotlight, her hair styled in perfect waves, her smile calibrated for the cameras already broadcasting her entrance. She didn't look at Sidney. Didn't acknowledge Reuben's existence. She was already in character, the beloved star, gracious and talented and real. The first 3 songs went exactly as planned. Her voice soared through the hall, note perfect, breath control flawless. Reuben listened with his perfect pitch, cataloging every sound. And there it was, the slight digital shimmer on her high notes, the way they sat on top of the mix instead of blending with it. The backing track was masterful. But it was there. No one else seemed to notice. The audience was enraptured. Then, during the transition to her 4th song, Florence's assistant whispered something urgent. Florence's expression flickered, irritation, then calculation. She turned to the audience, her microphone live, her smile brightening. "You know, I love bringing special guests on stage. Makes the night feel magical." Her eyes swept the wings and landed directly on Reuben. "You there? The young man in the white shirt. Come here." Reuben's stomach dropped. Sidney moved instinctively, but Trevor appeared from nowhere, blocking him with a hand on his chest. She called the boy, not you. 3,000 faces turned toward the wings. 3,000 phones adjusted focus. Reuben stood frozen, his mind screaming danger. This wasn't kindness. This was strategy. Come on, sweetheart, Florence coaxed, her voice honey-sweet for the audience. Don't be shy. Sidney's eyes met his son's. There was warning there, and helplessness. But Reuben walked forward anyway, each step taking him deeper into Florence's trap. When he reached her, she placed a hand on his shoulder, the grip tight enough to control him without the audience seeing. What's your name? Reuben. His voice barely reached the microphone. Reuben. That's beautiful. And your dad works here, doesn't he? She gestured toward Sidney, still trapped in the wings by Trevor. Taking care of the venue. Honest work. We should all appreciate people like that, shouldn't we? The audience applauded, a wave of performative gratitude that made Reuben's skin crawl. Florence crouched to his level, her eyes finding his with laser precision. There was no warmth there. Only calculation. Tell me something, Reuben. Her voice dropped to a stage whisper that carried through the hall. You've been watching me rehearse, haven't you? Hanging around backstage. I bet you've wondered what it's like up here. She stood, addressing the crowd now. Every child dreams of being on stage. Of singing in front of thousands of people. She turned back to him, and her smile sharpened. So let's find out. Can you even sing? The question landed like a slap. Reuben felt his face flush hot. The audience laughed, uncomfortable, uncertain, but still laughing. Florence's hand tightened on his shoulder. She leaned close, her lips near his ear, her voice dropping below the microphone's range but is still live. Be smart, kid. Say no. Walk away. Forget what you heard. But something in Reuben's chest cracked open. He thought of Sidney, watching from the wings. Of Margaret, typing through the night to pay bills. Of the recording he'd made in their kitchen, the voice he'd hidden because hiding was safer than being seen. He thought of Florence Ashby, standing here covered in diamonds and lies, asking him if he could sing while she couldn't. Yes, Reuben said into the microphone, his voice steady now. I can sing. Florence's expression froze for a fraction of a second. Then she recovered, her performer's instinct taking over. Wonderful. Then let's hear it. Everyone wants to know what the janitor's son can do. She snapped her fingers at the band. Give him, Eternal Aria. The last verse. The audience gasped. Eternal Aria was Florence's signature piece, the song that had made her famous. The final verse climbed relentlessly toward a high C that only the most trained sopranos could hit. It was impossible for a child. It was designed to be impossible. Sidney broke free from Trevor, rushing forward. Florence, please. It's okay, Dad. Reuben's voice was quiet, but it carried. He looked at his father, at the man who taught him that integrity mattered more than safety. It's okay. The orchestra began to play. The opening notes of Eternal Aria swelled through the hall, beautiful and treacherous. Florence handed Reuben her microphone, her smile never wavering, her eyes promising destruction. Reuben held the microphone in trembling hands. 3,000 phones recorded him. His father stood frozen in the wings. Florence waited for him to fail. And somewhere in his chest, beneath the fear and the fury, Reuben felt something else rising. Something that had been waiting his entire life for permission to exist. The music reached his entrance. He opened his mouth. And he began to sing. If you felt that knot in your stomach, the one that comes from watching someone be underestimated, from knowing a truth no one else sees, you're not alone in this moment. Sometimes the hardest thing is believing the story isn't over yet. Reuben's voice cut through the Grandview Concert Hall like light through darkness. Pure. Controlled. Impossible. The audience's laughter died in their throats. 3,000 people leaned forward as one, phones still recording, but no one was checking their screens anymore. They were listening to a 12-year-old boy sing Florence Ashby's signature aria with a technique that shouldn't exist in someone his age. He navigated the first verse flawlessly, his perfect pitch guiding him through the complex melodic line. His breath control was instinctive, his phrasing natural. But it was when he reached the bridge, when the music climbed toward that famous high C, that the hall went completely silent. Reuben's voice soared upward, each note clear and resonant. He wasn't straining. He wasn't forcing. He was simply singing the way he taught himself in his bedroom, in his kitchen, in all the hidden places where his gift had grown in secret. And then, just before the climactic high note, he stopped. He lowered the microphone and looked directly at Florence. "Turn the vocal track off." The words rang through the stunned silence. Florence's smile fractured. "Excuse me?" "The backing track. The one that's been carrying your high notes all night. Turn it off." The audience erupted in confused murmurs. Florence's face went pale beneath her stage makeup. Trevor was already moving from the wings, his phone pressed to his ear, barking orders. But Reuben kept talking, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. "I heard you this afternoon. In your dressing room. You can't sing above G5 anymore. The vocal surgery didn't heal right. So everything we've been hearing tonight, every signature note, every moment that made you famous, it's all pre-recorded." "That's absurd," Florence snapped, her performer's mask slipping. "This child is clearly." "Then prove it." Reuben held out the microphone. "Sing the high C live. Right now. No track." The challenge hung in the air like a grenade. Sidney had pushed past Trevor now, reaching the stage, his face torn between pride and terror for his son. The audience was on their feet, some shouting for Florence to sing, others demanding explanations, the whole hall descending into chaos. Florence looked at Trevor, who was gesturing frantically from the wings. She looked at the band, who'd stopped playing, their instruments silent. She looked at Reuben, this small boy who'd just destroyed her in front of 3,000 witnesses. "Security," she said, her voice cold. "Remove this child from my stage." 2 guards appeared, reaching for Reuben. Sidney intercepted them, his body blocking theirs, his voice rising for the first time in 12 years. "Don't you touch my son." But Reuben had already turned away. He walked to the edge of the stage, looked out at the sea of recording phones, and said clearly into the microphone, "I'm sorry you paid to see something that wasn't real. You deserved better." Then he handed the microphone to the nearest stagehand and walked off stage, his head high, his father following close behind. The hall exploded. They made it to the parking lot before Trevor caught up with them. He was flanked by 2 venue security guards and a woman in an expensive suit who introduced herself as Florence's attorney. "That was a very stupid thing to do," Trevor said, his voice icy. "Defamation. Interference with a performance. We're talking lawsuits that will destroy your family." Sidney stepped in front of Reuben. "He's 12 years old. Old enough to know better. Old enough to face consequences." Trevor pulled out his phone, showing them a screen already filling with social media posts. "This is going viral. Right now. Florence's career is being torn apart by a child's accusation. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to sign a statement saying he made it up. That he was jealous, attention-seeking. And in exchange, we won't sue you into bankruptcy." "No," Sidney said. "Think carefully. You have a family. A home. A job, for now. All of that goes away if you don't cooperate." Reuben felt his chest constrict. This was his fault. His exposure, his honesty, his refusal to stay silent. And now his family would pay the price. But then his phone buzzed. A text from Callum, his best friend from school. Got something. Call me. Urgent. Reuben looked at his father, at Trevor's threatening smile, at the security guards waiting to escort them off the property. He thought about Florence Ashby, still inside, probably surrounded by publicists crafting the narrative that would paint a 12-year-old as a liar. And he thought about his father's words, "You tell the truth anyway." "We need a minute," Reuben said. Before anyone could protest, he pulled Sidney aside, his phone already dialing. Callum answered on the first ring. "Dude. You're everywhere. Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, everyone's talking about it." "I know. Callum, they're threatening to sue us. That's why I called. Remember how I said I was building that audio monitoring script? The one that captures live venue feeds for copyright analysis." Reuben's heart started pounding. "Yeah. I had it running in the Grandview system. I've got the whole backstage audio log from this afternoon. Florence and her manager. The entire conversation about the vocal track. The fraud. Everything." Sidney's eyes widened. He'd heard enough of the conversation to understand what Callum was saying. "Can you send it to me?" Reuben asked. "Already did. Check your email." "But Reuben, once this goes out, there's no taking it back. They'll come after you hard." Reuben looked at his father. Sidney's face was pale, but his jaw was set. He nodded once. "Send it," Reuben said. "Send everything." Callum's voice was steady. "Already done. I uploaded it to 3 platforms simultaneously. It's out there now. And Reuben, your voice is trending too. People are calling you a prodigy. This might actually change everything." Reuben hung up and turned to face Trevor, who was watching with growing suspicion. "You should check your phone," Reuben said quietly. Trevor pulled out his phone. His expression went from confusion to fury in seconds. "What did you do?" "I told the truth," Reuben said. "And now everyone can hear it for themselves." Inside the concert hall, chaos had metastasized into crisis. Florence's team had evacuated her through the rear exit while her publicist attempted damage control from the stage, but the audience wasn't listening. They were on their phones, watching the backstage audio recording Callum had released spread across the internet like wildfire. Florence's voice, panicked and clear, "Trevor, I can't hit it. The surgeon said minimum 8 weeks. Trevor's response, calculating and cold, which is exactly why we're using the full vocal track. The conversation played on loop across social media platforms. Within minutes, music critics were weighing in. Industry insiders were sharing their own Florence Ashby rumors. The hashtag FloFraud was trending worldwide. But something else was trending too, hashtag Janitor's son. Reuben's voice, that brief verse he'd sung before exposing Florence, had been isolated and shared by musicians and vocal coaches. They were analyzing his technique, marveling at his range, dissecting the purity of his tone. People were calling him a prodigy. A diamond discovered in the rough. The real talent that Florence had tried to destroy. In the parking lot, Trevor's attorney was already on the phone, her voice rising as she paced. "How bad? How bad is?" She listened, her expression darkening. "Every single venue? All of them?" Trevor stood frozen, watching his phone screen with the expression of a man watching his empire crumble in real time. Florence's tour sponsors were issuing statements. Venues were canceling bookings. Her record label had released a carefully worded comment about investigating the allegations. "This isn't over," Trevor said, but his voice had lost its edge. He looked at Reuben with something that might have been hate or might have been grudging respect. You have no idea what you've started. Yes, I do, Reuben said. I started the truth. Sidney's hand found his son's shoulder. Together, they walked toward their car, leaving Trevor and his attorney and the wreckage of Florence Ashby's career behind them. The drive home was silent. Sidney's hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. Reuben stared out the window, watching the city lights blur past, trying to process what he'd just done. Dad? His voice was small. Did I do the right thing? Sidney pulled the car over, parking in an empty lot near their apartment complex. He turned to face his son, and Reuben saw tears in his father's eyes for the first time in his life. Reuben. What you did tonight, Sidney's voice cracked. I gave up music because I was afraid. Afraid I wasn't good enough. Afraid I'd fail. I convinced myself I was being practical, being responsible. But the truth is, I was scared. Dad. Let me finish. Sidney wiped his eyes. I've watched you hide your gift because I taught you to hide. I taught you that keeping your head down was safer than standing up. And tonight, you proved me wrong. He pulled Reuben into a hug, holding tight. You were braver than I've ever been. And I have never been more proud of anything in my entire life. Reuben's own tears came then, hot and relieved. Trevor said they're going to sue us. Let them try. The truth is on our side. And Reuben? Sidney pulled back, looking his son in the eyes. Whatever happens next, we face it together. As a family. They sat there in the car, father and son, both of them crying and laughing and trying to understand how their lives had been completely upended in the span of 3 hours. Reuben's phone buzzed. Then buzzed again. Then started ringing continuously. Messages poured in from numbers he didn't recognize, from social media accounts with verification checkmarks, from news outlets requesting interviews. One message stood out. It was from an email address with the suffix at berkeleyconservatory.edu. Mr. Hensley, my name is Dr. Patricia One, Dean of Admissions at Berkeley Music Conservatory. I've seen the video of your performance tonight. I'd like to discuss your future in music. Please call me at your earliest convenience. Sidney read the message over Reuben's shoulder. His breath caught. Berkeley. That's where you went, Reuben finished quietly. Sidney's hand trembled as he held the phone. They want to talk to you about your future. Reuben, do you understand what this means? Reuben looked at his father, at this man who'd sacrificed his dreams so his family could survive. It means I get to finish what you started. Sidney closed his eyes, overcome. When he opened them again, there was something new there. Hope. The first real hope Reuben had seen in his father's expression in years. Then let's call her, Sidney said. Let's see where this goes. But first, they needed to go home. To tell Margaret. To face whatever legal threats Trevor might still throw at them. To figure out how to navigate a world that had suddenly, impossibly, opened its doors. As they pulled into their apartment complex, Reuben looked up at their building, the peeling paint, the broken security light, the whole tired structure of their constrained life. Tomorrow, everything would be different. Tomorrow, there would be lawyers and interviews and decisions that could reshape their entire future. But tonight, they were still just themselves. Still the Hensleys. Still together. And that, Reuben thought, was enough. The lawsuits arrived by courier at 6:47 a.m., 3 manila envelopes thick with legal jargon and threats. Sidney signed for them at the door while Margaret read the documents over his shoulder, her face draining of color. Civil defamation seeking $2 million in damages, she read aloud. Tortious interference with business relationships. Intentional infliction of emotional distress. She looked up at her husband. "Sidney, we don't have money for a lawyer. We don't have money for—" "We'll figure it out," Sidney said, but his voice was hollow. Reuben stood in the doorway of his bedroom, still in his pajamas, watching his parents' world compress under the weight of his choices. The morning news played on their small TV, showing footage from last night's concert, Reuben's accusation, Florence's frozen expression, the chaos that followed. Every major outlet was covering it. Some defended Florence. Others called for investigations. The music industry was split down the middle. But Trevor Marsh's legal machine was moving faster than public opinion. By noon, a second courier arrived with an eviction notice. Their landlord, citing reputational damage to the property, was terminating their lease. 30 days to vacate. "This is because of me," Reuben said, his voice breaking. "Dad, I'm so sorry." "Stop." Margaret crossed the room, kneeling in front of her son. "What Trevor is doing isn't your fault. He's trying to silence you by hurting us. Don't let him." But the damage kept coming. Sidney's supervisor at the Grandview called at 2 p.m. His employment was being suspended pending investigation into theft of proprietary information. The claim was absurd. Sidney had nothing to do with Callum's audio recording, but it didn't matter. The venue's ownership had ties to Florence's management company. This was retaliation, pure and simple. By evening, their situation was dire. No income. No home in 30 days. $2 million in lawsuits they couldn't afford to fight. Margaret's transcription clients had started dropping her, spooked by the legal threats being circulated online by Florence's team. Reuben sat at the kitchen table, his phone face down. He couldn't look at it anymore. The messages had shifted from supportive to vicious. Florence's fans were doxing him, sending threats, calling him a liar and an attention seeker. Someone had leaked their address. Margaret had already called the police twice about suspicious cars idling outside. Sidney paced the tiny kitchen, his jaw tight, his eyes red-rimmed. "We need a lawyer. Someone who'll take this pro bono or—" "We can't afford or," Margaret said quietly. She sat at the table across from Reuben, her hands folded. "We can barely afford groceries." The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications none of them wanted to voice. Then Sidney's phone rang. Unknown number. He answered on speaker. "Mr. Hensley." The voice was smooth, professional. "My name is Gerald Reeves. I'm an attorney with Morrison & Block. We represent several parties interested in ensuring Florence Ashby's fraudulent practices are exposed. We'd like to offer our services to your family at no cost." Sidney exchanged glances with Margaret. "Why would you do that?" "Because Florence Ashby has been defrauding audiences for 6 months. Because she's threatened 3 other venue employees who noticed irregularities. Because your son dared to expose what many of us suspected but couldn't prove." Reeves paused. "And because Morrison & Block doesn't lose cases like this. What do you need from us?" "Everything you have. Every recording, every witness, every piece of documentation. We'll handle Trevor Marsh and his legal theatrics. But Mr. Hensley, you need to understand. This gets worse before it gets better. Much worse." Sidney looked at his son, at his wife, at the eviction notice on the table. How much worse could it get? Reeves didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was grim. "Trevor Marsh has ended careers for less than what Reuben did last night. He's not just protecting Florence. He's protecting a system that's made him very wealthy. He'll use every weapon he has." Margaret's hand found Reuben's. "Then we'll face it together." After they hung up, the apartment fell silent again. Through the thin walls, they could hear their neighbor's TV playing the news coverage on repeat. The story wouldn't die. And neither would the consequences. Reuben looked at his parents, these good people who'd never asked for any of this, and felt the crushing weight of what his honesty had cost them. Their home. Their income. Their safety. Dad? His voice was barely a whisper. What if I said I lied? What if I took it all back? Sidney crossed the room and knelt in front of his son. Then you'd become exactly what they're trying to make you. And Reuben? That's not who you are. That's not who we raised. But. No buts. We don't trade integrity for convenience. We don't betray ourselves to make bullies happy. Sidney's voice was firm. Whatever Trevor throws at us, we'll survive. We always have. Margaret nodded, her eyes glistening. We're the Hensleys. We don't quit. Reuben wanted to believe them. But outside their apartment, a car engine idled. A camera flash lit up their window. And somewhere across the city, Trevor Marsh was preparing his next attack. The backlash had only just begun. Trevor Marsh arrived at their apartment 3 days later without warning. He stood in the hallway with his expensive suit and practiced smile, holding a leather briefcase like a peace offering. Mr. Hensley. Mrs. Hensley. He nodded respectfully. I apologize for showing up unannounced. But I think we can resolve this situation in a way that benefits everyone. Sidney blocked the doorway. We have legal representation now. You should talk to them. I will. But first, I wanted to speak with you directly. Parent to parent. Trevor glanced past him toward where Reuben sat at the kitchen table. May I come in? Just 5 minutes. Margaret appeared behind Sidney, her expression hard. Whatever you're selling, we're not buying. I'm not selling anything. I'm offering a solution. Trevor opened his briefcase, removing a single document. Florence's career is damaged. Your family is suffering. The media is tearing both sides apart. This benefits no one. Then Florence should admit the truth, Sidney said. She can't. Her contracts, her endorsements, her insurance policies, they all have integrity clauses. Admission of fraud triggers penalty clauses totaling over $70 million. She'd be financially destroyed. She destroyed herself, Margaret said. We didn't make her fake her performances. No. But Reuben did make the accusation public. And that action has consequences. Trevor held up the document. This is a simple statement. Reuben admits he made a mistake. He misheard a conversation. He was confused, overwhelmed, perhaps seeking attention. Florence's team agrees to drop all lawsuits. Your family receives $50,000 as a good faith payment for the distress this has caused. The number hung in the air like smoke. $50,000. More than Margaret made in a year. Enough to cover legal fees, rent deposits, months of breathing room while they rebuilt. Sidney's jaw tightened. You want us to call our son a liar? I want you to consider your family's future. $50,000, all legal issues resolved, and this whole nightmare ends. Trevor set the document on the small table near the door. Florence is willing to frame it as a misunderstanding. No harm to Reuben's reputation. Just a confused child who got caught up in something he didn't fully understand. No. Sidney's voice was flat. Sidney, wait, Margaret's hand touched his arm. We should at least think about. There's nothing to think about. Sidney looked at Trevor with something close to pity. You're trying to buy my son's integrity for the price of a used car. The answer is no. Trevor's smile never wavered, but his eyes went cold. Mr. Hensley. You're unemployed. You're being evicted. Your wife is losing clients. You have no income and mounting legal bills. This offer is your lifeline. Then we'll drown with our dignity intact. Dad, Reuben's voice came from the kitchen. He'd stood up, his face pale. Maybe we should. Reuben, go to your room. But the money could. I said go to your room. Sidney's voice cracked like thunder. Reuben flinched, then obeyed, disappearing down the hallway. Sidney turned back to Trevor. My son doesn't get to watch me sell his truth. He doesn't get to learn that lesson from me. Trevor picked up the document, sliding it back into his briefcase. You're making a mistake. Florence has resources you can't imagine. She'll bury you in legal fees. She'll make sure you never work in this city again. She'll do whatever she's going to do. Margaret stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. But she won't make us betray our son. Now get out of our home. Trevor studied them both for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. I'll be honest with you. I admire your principles. I do. But principles don't feed your family. They don't keep you housed. And when you're living in your car next month, wondering if you made the right choice, remember this moment. He walked to the door, paused. The offer expires in 24 hours. After that, Florence moves forward with the full legal assault. $2 million in damages. Asset seizure. Wage garnishment for life. Think carefully. He left. Sidney closed the door and leaned against it, his whole body trembling. Margaret sank onto the couch, her face in her hands. Sidney. $50,000. We could what? Teach Reuben that money matters more than truth. That's when things get hard, you abandon your values. Sidney crossed to her, kneeling. Margaret, I know you're scared. I'm terrified. But if we do this, we lose more than money. We lose ourselves. But what if we can't survive this? What if? Then we don't survive. But we don't survive as people who sold out our son to a fraud. In his bedroom, Reuben pressed his ear to the door, listening to his parents argue in whispered, desperate tones. He heard his mother crying. Heard his father trying to comfort her. Heard the weight of consequences crushing them both. And he understood, with terrible clarity, that this was his fault. His exposure. His refusal to stay silent. His choice. He pulled out his phone, staring at Trevor's business card that had been slipped under their door earlier. He could call. He could take it all back. He could save his family with one lie. His finger hovered over the number. Outside, rain started falling, drumming against the windows like accusations. Inside, his parents held each other in the dark, trying to figure out how to survive the morning. And Reuben sat on his bed, Trevor's card in his hand, wondering if integrity was worth losing everything. Sometimes the price of truth feels too high to pay. Sometimes you wonder if the people who ask you to be brave understand what it costs. If you've ever stood at that edge, caught between what's right and what's survivable, then you know exactly where Reuben is right now. And you know how much it takes to keep standing. Callum's video dropped at midnight. He'd titled it simply, The Full Truth, Unedited Backstage Audio, Florence Ashby Fraud Exposed. By 3 a.m., it had 2 million views. By sunrise, 15 million. By noon, it was the most shared piece of content on every major social media platform. The audio was devastating in its clarity. Florence and Trevor's entire conversation, captured with perfect fidelity. Every admission. Every calculated decision. Every threat to silence potential whistleblowers. Callum had even included time-stamped metadata proving the recording predated Reuben's public accusation. The evidence was irrefutable. Within hours, Florence's remaining defenders went silent. Her record label issued a statement terminating her contract effective immediately. Her tour sponsors pulled their backing. Venues announced refunds for ticket holders. The Grammy organization launched an ethics investigation. The fraud wasn't alleged anymore. It was proven. Sidney's phone rang at 7 a.m. It was his supervisor at the Grandview. "Mr. Hensley. I'm calling to inform you that your suspension has been lifted. We're also prepared to offer a formal apology and back pay for the days you missed. Additionally, if you're interested, we have a venue operations coordinator position opening. Salary, benefits, and management track." Sidney sat at the kitchen table, stunned. "I don't understand." "You were right. Florence's team pressured us to fire you. We should have protected you instead. This is us trying to make it right." After he hung up, Margaret's phone rang. Then Reuben's. Then the apartment landline they barely used. Journalists. Agents. Talent scouts. Representatives from music schools. Everyone wanted to talk to the boy who'd exposed Florence Ashby. Everyone wanted to hear him sing. But the call that mattered most came at 2 p.m. from Drive Patricia 1 at Berkeley Conservatory. "Mr. Hensley, I've reviewed the full recording of your son's performance," she said, her voice warm but professional. "His technique is extraordinary." "Self-taught, you said?" "Yes, ma'am," Sidney confirmed, putting the phone on speaker so Margaret and Reuben could hear. "Everything he knows, he learned from recordings and textbooks. Then he's one of the most naturally gifted vocalists I've encountered in 30 years of teaching. Mr. Hensley, I'd like to offer Reuben a full scholarship to our youth conservatory program. Room, board, tuition, private instruction with our top faculty. Everything covered." The room went silent. Reuben's eyes went wide. Margaret grabbed Sidney's hand. "The program starts this fall," Dr. Wan continued. "It's intensive, 6 days a week, year-round. But for a talent like Reuben's, it would be transformative. He'd be studying with the same instructors who've trained performers at the Met, at La Scala, at every major opera house in the world." Sidney's voice caught. "Dr. Wan, this is incredibly generous. But I need to ask. Why? Why take this risk on a 12-year-old who's currently at the center of a media firestorm?" Dr. Wan laughed softly. "Because he told the truth when it was dangerous. Because he has a gift that deserves nurturing. And frankly, because Berkeley was built on the principle that talent shouldn't be limited by circumstance. Your son is exactly the kind of student we exist to serve. Can we have time to think about it?" Margaret asked. "This is a lot to process." "Of course. But Mrs. Hensley, opportunities like this don't wait forever. Call me within the week." After they hung up, the three of them sat in silence, trying to absorb what had just been offered. "Berkeley," Sidney whispered. His voice was thick with emotion. "Reuben, do you understand what this means?" Reuben nodded slowly. "It means I get to learn properly. It means I get to train with real teachers. It means more than that." Sidney's eyes were wet. "It means you get to become everything I never could. Everything I always dreamed you'd be." Margaret pulled them both into a hug, all three of them crying now, relief and joy and exhausted hope flooding through them at once. Outside, the media circus continued. Florence's career was disintegrating in real time. Trevor Marsh had gone silent, reportedly in consultation with crisis management teams. The lawsuits against the Hensleys had been quietly withdrawn. Their landlord had called, apologizing and offering to extend their lease at the current rate. The world had shifted. The truth had won. But that night, as Reuben lay in bed watching the ceiling fan turn slowly overhead, he thought about Florence Ashby. About how one lie had grown into an empire, and how one moment of honesty had torn it all down. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt tired. And sad. And aware, in a way he hadn't been before, that exposing someone's fraud meant destroying their life. His phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number: "You destroyed me. I hope you're happy." Reuben stared at the message for a long time. Then he typed back, "I'm sorry you lost everything. But I'm not sorry I told the truth." He blocked the number and set his phone face down. In the living room, he could hear his parents talking quietly, planning, hoping, dreaming about futures that had seemed impossible just days ago. They'd survived the worst. They'd held on to their integrity. And now, improbably, they were being rewarded for it. Reuben closed his eyes and let himself believe, just for a moment, that maybe everything would be okay. The Berkeley Conservatory acceptance ceremony took place 3 months later in a small auditorium that smelled like old wood and possibility. 27 students from around the world sat in the front rows with their families, each of them offered full scholarships to the youth program. Each of them exceptional in their own way. But when Dr. Wen called Reuben's name, the applause was different. Longer. Warmer. Everyone in that room knew his story. Reuben walked to the stage in the new suit Margaret had bought him, his first suit ever, dark blue with a crisp white shirt. Sidney sat in the third row, wearing his own new clothes, the promotion from the Grandview having come with a salary that made breathing easier. Margaret sat beside him, her hand in his, both of them unable to stop smiling. Dr. Wen shook Reuben's hand, then surprised him by not letting go. She turned to the audience. Most of you know Reuben's story. What you might not know is what it takes to sing the way he did that night. To be 12 years old, terrified, under attack, and still produce a tone that pure. She looked at Reuben. That's not just talent. That's character. And character is something we can't teach. You either have it, or you don't. She released his hand and gestured to the piano in the corner. I've asked Reuben to sing for us today. Not because he needs to prove anything. But because talent like his deserves to be celebrated, not just dissected by social media. Reuben's stomach clenched. He hadn't been expecting this. Dr. Wen smiled encouragingly. No pressure. But if you're willing. He looked at his father. Sidney nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. And Reuben understood, in that moment, that this wasn't about proving himself to Berkeley. This was about reclaiming music as something joyful instead of something weaponized. He walked to the piano. The accompanist asked what he wanted to sing. Reuben thought for a moment, then chose, O mio babino caro, Puccini's love letter to fathers and daughters, reinterpreted as a son's tribute to the man who'd sacrificed everything. The piano began. Reuben closed his eyes and sang. His voice filled the auditorium with the same purity that had shocked the Grandview audience, but now it carried something else. Confidence. Peace. The freedom that comes from knowing you told the truth and survived. He navigated the piece flawlessly, his breath control impeccable, his phrasing mature beyond his years. When he reached the final phrase, that delicate, soaring resolution, he opened his eyes and looked directly at his father. Sidney was openly weeping. Margaret beside him, her hand over her mouth. And Reuben sang the last note for them, for the family that had refused to break even when breaking would have been easier. The auditorium erupted in applause. But Reuben barely heard it. He was already walking down from the stage, past the other students, straight to where his father sat. Sidney stood, pulling him into a hug that lifted him off the ground. I'm so proud of you, Sidney whispered. So incredibly proud. I learned it from you, Dad. They stood there holding each other while the applause continued, while Margaret joined them, while the whole auditorium witnessed a family that had survived the fire and emerged stronger. Later, during the reception, Dr. Wen pulled Sidney aside. Your son is going to be extraordinary. I've been doing this a long time, and I've never seen raw talent quite like his. He gets it from his mother, Sidney said automatically. No. Dr. Wen smiled. He gets the gift from genetics. But the courage? The integrity? That came from you. She handed him a business card. We have a community outreach program. We're looking for instructors who can teach music theory to underserved youth. The pay isn't tremendous, but it's honest work with students who need it. If you're interested. Sidney stared at the card, his hand trembling. I don't have a degree. I only finished 1 semester. You raised a son who changed the music industry by telling the truth. That's a better credential than any degree. She squeezed his shoulder. Think about it. But Sidney, you don't have to live in your son's shadow. You can have your own second chance. After she walked away, Sidney stood there holding the card, years of regret and possibility warring in his chest. Margaret found him, reading the expression on his face immediately. She offered you something. A teaching position. Music theory for kids who can't afford a conservatory. That's perfect. She stopped, seeing his hesitation. What's wrong? What if I'm not good enough? What if I failed once, and I'll fail again? Margaret took his face in her hands. You didn't fail, Sidney. You chose to support your family. But now you get to make a different choice. Not instead of us. Alongside us. Sidney looked across the room at Reuben, who was talking with other students, his face bright with excitement about the program ahead. His son. His brave, talented, honest son who'd refused to stay silent even when silence would have been safer. Okay, Sidney said quietly. Okay, I'll try. 6 months later, on a Tuesday evening in February, Sidney stood in front of 15 students ranging from ages 8 to 14. They sat in the Berkeley Community Outreach Center, a converted warehouse in a neighborhood not unlike the one the Hensleys had come from. These kids had talent. They had dreams. But they didn't have access. Until now. Music theory isn't about memorizing rules, Sidney told them, his voice steady and sure. It's about understanding why beauty works the way it does. It's about giving you the tools to create something that matters. One girl in the back row raised her hand. Mr. Hensley. Is it true your son exposed Florence Ashby? Sidney smiled. It's true. And you know what he taught me? That talent without integrity is just noise. But talent combined with courage? That's something that can change the world. He turned to the whiteboard, beginning his lesson on chord progressions. Behind him, 15 students leaned forward, hungry to learn, hungry to become. And Sidney Hensley, former janitor, former failed conservatory student, former man who'd given up on his dreams, taught them everything he knew. Not because he was perfect. But because he'd finally learned that second chances aren't given. They're chosen. In the audience sat Margaret, who'd taken a break from her transcription work to watch. And Reuben, home for the weekend from Berkeley, his own studies progressing even faster than Dr. Wen had predicted. They watched Sidney teach, watched him light up in a way they'd never seen before, and they understood that the story hadn't just saved Reuben's future. It had saved all of them. The Florence Ashby scandal faded from headlines eventually, replaced by newer controversies and fresher disasters. Florence herself retreated from public life, last seen teaching vocal technique at a small college in Oregon, far from the stages that had once worshipped her. Trevor Marsh's career ended. Multiple former clients came forward with their own stories of manipulation and fraud. He was disbarred from representing talent, his empire of carefully constructed lies collapsing the same way Florence's had. The Grandview Concert Hall installed a plaque in the staff break room, "Integrity matters more than convenience." It was Sidney's idea. Management agreed. And Reuben? He studied. He practiced. He grew into his gift under the guidance of professors who understood that talent needed nurturing, not exploitation. He performed in student showcases, then regional competitions, then national stages. His voice matured, deepened, and gained power without losing its purity. 3 years after that night at the Grandview, he performed at the Kennedy Center. Sidney and Margaret sat in the audience, tears streaming down their faces as their son sang Puccini to a crowd of thousands. Real thousands. Not phones. Not viral moments. Just people, present and listening. After the performance, a journalist asked Reuben if he regretted what he'd done to Florence Ashby. "I regret that she made choices that destroyed her," Reuben said carefully. "But I don't regret telling the truth. Because the truth is what sets all of us free." That quote made headlines. But Reuben didn't care about headlines anymore. He cared about music. About integrity. About being worthy of the sacrifices his parents had made. And every time he sang, he remembered that night when he'd been 12 years old and terrified, standing on a stage under accusatory lights, choosing honesty over safety. It had cost everything. And it had given him everything in return. The standing ovation at the Kennedy Center lasted 7 minutes. But it was the quiet moment afterward, backstage, when Sidney hugged his son and whispered, "I love you, and I'm proud of who you are," that was the moment that mattered most. Because some victories aren't measured in applause. They're measured in the person you become when no one's watching. And Reuben Hensley, the janitor's son who changed the music industry by refusing to stay silent, had become exactly who his father raised him to be. Someone honest. Someone brave. Someone real. The rest was just music.